The wind came down from the north with a promise of teeth. It was the back end of 1884 in the Montana Territory, a time when the year died not with a gentle sigh, but with a snarl. The aspens along Willow Creek had already surrendered their gold, leaving skeletal fingers to scratch at a sky the color of a tarnished pewter cup. Winter was not coming. It was already here, perched on the high ridges, waiting for the first real snow to claim the valley. Down by the creek, where the water ran low and dark over smooth stones, Sarah Brennan worked. She moved with the steady, metronomic rhythm of someone who knew that to stop was to freeze, not just in body but in spirit. Each day was a battle fought with an axe, a saw, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. She was a young woman, though the lines of worry and concentration around her eyes might have belonged to someone older. A widow. They called her in Timber Creek, the one time she'd gone for salt and flour. The word was a brand, marking her as something incomplete, an object of pity or suspicion. She paid it no mind. Pity didn't raise a wall, and suspicion didn't keep the wind out. Her cabin was rising one log at a time. She had felled the pines herself, higher up the slope, limbed them, and dragged them down with her mule, a cantankerous old beast named Jedediah, who seemed to work purely out of spite. The foundation was set, the floor laid. Now, she was fitting the walls, notching the logs with a skill born of desperation and the faded memory of watching her father build a barn when she was a girl. Her hands, raw and blistered beneath worn leather gloves, ached with a fire that settled deep in her bones each night. But with every log she wrestled into place, she felt a grim satisfaction. This was hers. This small patch of earth, this box of wood and mud, would belong to no one but her and the memory of a man she was trying to forget. High above, on the pine-stubbled ridge that formed the western wall of the valley, Jacob Hartwell watched. He did this every morning, a ritual as ingrained as his first cup of coffee. He would rise before dawn, his large ranch house silent and cold around him, and ride his gray gelding to the overlook. From there, he could see his entire spread, a vast, prosperous piece of land that felt as hollow as a drum. His cattle were dots of black and brown in the distance. His fences were straight and true, but the heart of the place had been ripped out 3 years ago. He was a man in his 40s, broad in the shoulder and weathered by a life lived under the sun and sky. But a stillness had settled over him, a quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a house where laughter had died. The fever had taken his wife, Margaret, and then his little boy, Thomas. Within a week of each other, he had buried them himself on a knoll behind the house, and in doing so, had buried a part of himself he knew would never be recovered. Since then, he had simply existed. He ran his ranch with cold efficiency, his orders to his foreman, Moses, given in a low, flat voice. He ate, he slept, he worked. He did not live. Then the woman had come. He'd first seen her 2 months back, a lone figure with a stubborn mule, staking a claim on the parcel by the creek. He'd thought her a fool. No woman alone could survive a Montana winter out here. He'd expected her to last a week, maybe 2, before she packed her meager belongings and fled back to whatever civilization had spit her out. But she had stayed, and she had worked. Jacob, a man who understood the language of hard labor better than he did the spoken word, found himself captivated. He watched her fell trees that seemed impossibly large. He watched her hew and notch the logs with a precision that bespoke a fierce intelligence. He saw the slump in her shoulders at the end of the day, and the straightness of her spine when she started again the next morning. He watched her, and he felt a confusing tangle of emotions. Admiration, certainly. Pity, perhaps, though he suspected she would throw it back in his face. And something else, a flicker of warmth in the cold ashes of his heart that felt like a betrayal. Each time he looked at her, at the simple, determined line of her body against the vast, indifferent landscape, he felt the ghost of his wife at his shoulder. Margaret had been soft and kind, her hands made for kneading dough and holding a child, not for swinging an axe. This woman, this Sarah Brennan, was made of different stuff. She was forged from the same hard iron as the land itself. The guilt was a constant companion. It was one thing to honor the dead. It was another to feel a pull toward the living. It felt like a desecration of Margaret's memory, a stain on the pure, perfect grief he had cultivated like a winter garden. So he kept his distance, perched on his ridge, a silent, unseen observer. The ridge was a boundary, a line he would not cross. It separated his world of loss from her world of struggle. It kept the past and the present from colliding. He was the guardian of his own loneliness, and he would not abdicate his post. One afternoon, the air grew unnaturally still. The constant whisper of the wind through the pines ceased, and a heavy silence descended on the valley. Sarah had just managed to hoist a particularly heavy log onto the wall, her muscles screaming in protest. She stood for a moment, breathing heavily, her hands on her hips. She wiped a stray strand of sweat-damp hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on her skin. It was the silence that made her look up. The world was rarely quiet here. There was always the wind, the creak, the cry of a hawk. This sudden hush felt like a held breath. Her eyes scanned the landscape, the browning grasses, the dark, stoic pines, and then she saw him, a man on a horse, silhouetted against the gray sky on the high ridge. He was too far for her to make out his features, but she did not need to. She had felt his eyes on her for weeks. She had dismissed it at first, telling herself it was just the paranoia of a woman alone, the feeling of being watched by the wilderness itself. But it was more than that. It was a focused, persistent presence. She did not look away, did not drop her gaze in fear or modesty. She held it. Her own life had been stripped down to the bare essentials: work, eat, sleep, survive. There was no room for pretense. She simply stood, her feet planted firmly on the earth she intended to call home, and looked at the stranger who watched her build it. From his vantage point, Jacob felt the impact of her gaze like a physical blow. He had grown so accustomed to his invisibility that being seen was a shock to his system. He saw her head lift, her body go still, and then her eyes, even from this distance, seemed to lock onto his. He could not see their color, but he could feel their weight. They were not accusing, not inviting, not fearful. They were simply aware. In that long, silent moment, stretching across the valley that separated them, a current of understanding seemed to pass between them. It was the simple, profound recognition of one lonely soul acknowledging another. His heart gave a painful lurch in his chest, a muscle contracting after years of disuse. The feeling was so foreign, so unwelcome, that his first instinct was to pull on the reins, to turn his horse and flee back to the safety of his empty house. The guilt washed over him, hot and suffocating. Margaret's face, smiling and serene, rose in his mind, and he felt like the worst kind of traitor. He was a man mourning his family, not a lonely rancher spying on a neighbor. He broke the gaze first, wrenching his eyes away and spurring his horse into a trot along the ridge, not looking back. Sarah watched him go, a small, tight knot forming in her stomach. The stranger's presence was a complication she did not need. Her isolation was a shield. She had come here to escape the whispers, the knowing glances, the pity that felt like a judgment. She had come here to outrun the memory of her husband, Ben, not of his love, but of his end. The injustice of it was a bitter pill she swallowed every morning. Ben had been a good man, a dreamer, but he had trusted the wrong people in a land dispute that had turned ugly. He had been accused, disgraced, and the shame had followed him to an early, lonely grave, leaving her with a secret that festered in the quiet of her own heart. The man on the ridge was part of the world she had left behind, a world of men and their laws, their judgments, their desires. His silent observation was an intrusion, a reminder that no matter how far she ran, she could not escape the fact that she was a woman alone, a curiosity, a problem to be solved or a prize to be claimed. She picked up her axe, the familiar weight of it a comfort in her hands, the grain of the wood, the clean scent of pine, the satisfying thud of the blade. This was her reality. This was controllable. She swung the axe, the motion fluid and powerful. Channeling her unease into the work, she would build her house. She would survive the winter. She would not let the gaze of a lonely man on a distant ridge shake the foundation of the life she was building. One log, one painful effort at a time. But as the sun began to dip below that very ridge, casting long, cold shadows across the valley, she found her eyes drifting back to the spot where he had been. The ridge was empty now, a dark line drawn between the earth and the fading sky. It was a border, she thought, between what was and what could be, between the crushing weight of the past and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a tremor of something other than grief or determination. It was a feeling she could not name, a quiet disquiet that settled over her as the first stars began to prick the deepening twilight. She was being watched, and she was no longer entirely alone. She did not know if that was a comfort or a curse. The change came 3 days after she saw him on the ridge. It began not with a fury, but with a quiet, ominous bleed of gray from the north that slowly consumed the sky. The air grew heavy, thick with a cold that seeped into the marrow. Sarah felt it as a pressure in her bones, an ancient warning she was too new to this land to fully comprehend. By midday, the first flakes began to drift down, fat and wet and lazy. They were a novelty at first, melting on the dark, damp wood of her half-finished roof. But by the hour, they grew smaller, harder, and began to fly sideways on a wind that had found its voice. She had been working on the roof, laying the split log sheathing that would eventually hold the sod. It was slow, back-breaking work, hauling the heavy pieces up the rickety ladder she'd built, nailing them into the purlins. She was less than halfway done. The gaping hole in her roof was a raw, open wound, and the snow was the salt. She scrambled to cover it with the thin, patched canvas she owned, but the wind treated it like a plaything, tearing at it, whipping the corners from her grasp and sending a shower of icy pellets into her face. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache of her exhaustion. This was not a gentle autumn snowfall. This was a siege. The wind howled around the corners of her small cabin, a mournful, hungry sound. Every gust threatened to tear the canvas to shreds, to funnel the storm into the heart of her sanctuary, to ruin the flour and salt she'd so carefully stored, to soak the kindling she needed to stay alive. She fought it with a desperate strength, her fingers numb, her body a single, taut muscle against the gale. She used rocks, rope, anything she could find to weigh down the edges, but it was a losing battle. The storm was a giant, and she was a gnat buzzing in its face. Defeat settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She was going to fail. After all this, she would be beaten by the sky. It was through the white, swirling curtain of snow that she saw him coming. At first, he was just a dark shape, a smudge of gray against the white, moving with a steady, unhurried pace that seemed impossible in the chaos of the storm. It was the man from the ridge. He was riding his gelding and leading a pack horse, both animals with their heads lowered against the wind. He did not ride to the front of her cabin, but circled to the side, where the woodpile offered a small measure of shelter from the worst of the wind. He dismounted with an economy of motion, his long duster whipping around him. He said nothing. He didn't even look at her, there on her knees on the roof, a pathetic and frozen figure. His attention was on the pack horse. He unlashed a heavy, oilskin-wrapped bundle and a coil of thick rope. He slung a canvas bag of tools over his shoulder and, with the large bundle in his arms, walked toward the cabin. Sarah scrambled down the ladder, her legs stiff and clumsy. She stood before him, blocking his way, her chin thrust forward. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted to be heard over the gale. Jacob Hartwell looked at her then, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, the color of the winter sky. They held no pity, only a calm assessment of the situation. "Roof's open," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind's shriek. "I can see that," she snapped, hugging herself against a sudden, violent shiver. "I don't need your help." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He shifted the weight of the bundle in his arms. It was a large, heavy-duty canvas tarp, the kind used for covering wagons. "I don't reckon the storm cares what you need." He made to move past her. She sidestepped, putting herself in his path again. Her pride, raw and scraped, was the only thing keeping her upright. "I won't take charity." For the first time, a flicker of something impatience, maybe, or just weariness, crossed his face. "This isn't charity, ma'am. This is weather." He looked up at the groaning sky, then back at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "It's called being neighbors. Now, are you going to help me get this tarp on your roof, or are you going to stand here and freeze arguing about it?" The simple, irrefutable logic of his words deflated her anger, leaving only the cold, hard reality of her situation. He was right. The storm didn't care about her pride. She gave a single curt nod, the bitterness of her surrender tasting like ash in her mouth. What followed was a silent, desperate ballet against the wind. He was impossibly strong, yet moved with a surprising agility. He climbed the ladder as if the wind were a mere nuisance, the tarp slung over his shoulder. Sarah followed, her own movement spurred on by a mixture of shame and a grim determination to prove she was not useless. Together, they fought the canvas, a wild, bucking thing that wanted to take flight. He seemed to know exactly what to do, shouting clipped instructions that she found herself obeying without thought. "Hold this end. Pull it taut. Nail here." He worked with a focused intensity, his face set in hard lines against the stinging snow. She watched his hands large, calloused, competent as they drove nails with swift, sure strokes, as they tied knots that held fast against the storm's fury. There was no room for thought, only for action. They moved in a strange, unspoken rhythm, their bodies brushing against each other in the cramped space, their breaths pluming and instantly vanishing in the frigid air. For a long, grueling hour, they were not a man and a woman, not a stranger and a widow. They were two people with a single purpose to beat back the storm. And they did. When the last corner was secured, the last rope tied, a relative quiet fell over them. The wind still howled, but its attack was thwarted. The roof was sealed. Below them, in the small, dim space of her cabin, there was shelter. Jacob slid down the ladder first, when Sarah reached the bottom. Her legs were trembling so badly she nearly fell. He reached out a hand, steadying her by the elbow. His touch was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She pulled her arm away as if burned. He seemed not to notice, or to ignore it if he did. He walked back to his horses, which stood patiently, their backs dusted with snow. From the pack horse, he unlashed a heavy burlap sack and a wooden crate. He carried them to her door and set them just inside, out of the snow. "What's that?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Some supplies," he said, not looking at her. "Salt pork, coffee, some oats for your mule." He paused. "And a lantern. It'll be dark soon." "I can't pay you for this." The words felt stiff and clumsy in her mouth. "I'm not asking for pay." He turned then, and his gray eyes met hers. "The first winter is the hardest. No sense in facing it with an empty larder." He pulled his hat down lower, a gesture that seemed to signal the end of the conversation. "Good day, ma'am." He swung himself up onto his horse, gathered the reins of the pack animal, and rode out into the storm without a backward glance. Sarah stood in the doorway and watched until the swirling snow swallowed him completely. She closed the door, the solid thud echoing in the small space. The silence was absolute. The wind was a muffled roar outside, but inside it was still. She leaned her back against the door, her whole body shaking with a violence that frightened her. It wasn't the cold. She had been cold for months. This was something else. This was the tremor of breached defenses, the shock of a kindness she had not asked for and did not feel she deserved. Her gaze fell on the sack in the crate. A stranger had ridden through a blizzard to save her home, had asked for nothing, and had left her with food. She sank to the floor, her legs giving way, and wrapped her arms around her knees. The shaking wouldn't stop. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of gratitude. Not yet. It was a tear of pure, overwhelming confusion. Her carefully constructed world of solitude and self-reliance had just been shattered by a quiet man with gray eyes and a heavy canvas tarp. Jacob rode with the wind at his back, the fight with the storm, the simple, physical act of doing something that mattered, had lit a fire in his blood he hadn't felt in years. He felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of purpose that the daily, monotonous work of the ranch no longer provided. He had crossed the ridge. He had interfered, and he did not regret it. He knew what it was to be alone against the elements. He could not, in good conscience, have sat in his warm house and watched that woman's stubborn efforts be wiped away. It would have been a sin against the very grit he admired in her. When he reached his ranch, the lights of the main house and the bunkhouse were warm, yellow smudges in the twilight. Moses was waiting for him on the porch of the main house, nursing a mug of coffee. The old foreman was a man whose face was a roadmap of 70 hard years, his eyes missing nothing. "Storm seems to be letting up, boss," Moses said, his voice a dry crackle. "For now," Jacob replied, swinging down from the saddle, his movements stiff. Moses took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes appraising Jacob over the rim of the mug. "You look like you wrestled a bear and lost, but you're glad you got in the fight." Jacob just grunted, uncinching his saddle. "That widow woman's cabin still standing?" Moses asked, his tone casual. Jacob stopped what he was doing and finally looked at his foreman. "It is." Moses nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He set his mug down on the railing. "Funny thing," he said, his voice dropping a little. "For the last 3 years, you've looked like a man walking around with a stopped heart. Tonight you just look like a man who found it beating again." Jacob had no answer for that. He turned away from the old man's perceptive gaze, pulled the saddle from his horse's back, and carried it toward the barn. But the words followed him into the warm, hay-scented darkness. He could still feel the phantom weight of the woman's elbow in his hand, still see the fierce, defensive pride in her eyes, and deep in his chest, beneath the layers of grief and guilt, he could feel it too, a slow, steady, unfamiliar rhythm, thump, 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 a heart remembering its purpose. He came back the next day. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent, blanketed in a pristine layer of white. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale, watery disk that offered little warmth but cast a blinding glare off the snow. Sarah was outside, assessing the damage, her breath a cloud in the frigid air, when she saw him ride over the low rise to the east. He was not leading a pack horse this time, just riding his gray gelding, a saw and an axe tied to his saddle. She stiffened, her hand going to the handle of the axe that was never far from her side. Her first instinct was to send him away. The debt she owed him for his help in the storm was a heavy, uncomfortable weight. His continued presence would only make it heavier. He dismounted near the unfinished cabin, his movements deliberate. He did not offer a greeting, merely looked from her to the roof, then to the pile of uncut logs. "You lost a day's work to the storm," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an offer of pity. "You'll lose more trying to clear this snow alone." "I'll manage," she said, her voice tight. Jacob Hartwell looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. He seemed to consider her words. then gave a slow nod. "I reckon you would," he said. "But it would be a foolish waste of daylight." Without another word, he untied his own axe from his saddle, swung it onto his shoulder, and walked toward the wood pile. He did not ask her permission. He simply began to work, his back to her, the steady, rhythmic chunk of his axe against wood the only sound in the frozen air. Sarah stood for a long moment, watching him. A war raged inside her. Her pride demanded that she tell him to leave, that she assert her independence. But her weary, aching body and the cold, hard logic of the calendar told a different story. Winter had fired its first warning shot. She did not have the luxury of pride. With a frustrated sigh that fogged the air before her, she picked up her own axe and joined him. And so it began. He returned every day, as reliable as the sunrise. They worked in a shared silence that was, at first, taut with unspoken questions and mutual suspicion. But the work itself became their language. It was a language of pure, physical effort, of shared goals and measured rhythms. There was no room for misunderstanding in the swing of an axe or the pull of a saw. A log was either notched correctly or it was not. A wall was either true or it would fall. She learned the quiet cadence of his labor. He never wasted emotion. His strength was not explosive but a deep, steady well from which he drew all day without complaint. He could lift the end of a log that took all of her might to simply budge. He taught her, through demonstration rather than instruction, a better way to use the adze to flatten the interior walls, a way that saved her back and produced a cleaner cut. He, in turn, learned the shape of her stubbornness. He saw the fierce concentration in her eyes as she mastered a new task, the way she would bite her lip when a notch wasn't quite right, refusing to move on until it was perfect. He saw her grit, the way she pushed past exhaustion, her slim frame holding a strength that seemed to come not from muscle, but from some unbendable core of will. They were two solitary people, accustomed to the lonely echo of their own efforts, now finding a strange harmony in the rasp of a two-man saw pulled between them. Trust was not given in words. It was earned in the shared weight of a log. It was built in the unspoken understanding that he would hold his end, that she would do her part. It grew in the quiet moments when he would pass her a canteen of water without being asked, or when she would have a fire going and a pot of coffee brewing when he arrived in the cold, gray dawn. It was a fragile structure they were building, much like the cabin, erected one piece at a time. The moment it changed for him came on a cold, clear afternoon. They were wrestling the main ridgepole into place, a massive pine that would be the spine of her new home. It was the heaviest piece yet. They had worked for an hour to build a ramp and a crude scaffold. Now, with ropes and levers and every ounce of their combined strength, they were inching it up the ramp. He was below, pushing, his shoulder pressed into the rough bark, his boots digging into the frozen ground for purchase. She was above him on the wall, pulling on a rope, her body braced, her face a mask of fierce determination. "A little more," she grunted, the words tight with effort. "Just to the notch." He gave a final, mighty shove, and the great log slid into place with a solid, satisfying thud. It settled onto the gable ends, straight and true. The backbone of the house was set. He let out a long breath, leaning against the cabin wall, his muscles trembling from the strain. He looked up at her. She remained on the wall for a moment, her hand resting on the great log, a gesture that was almost a caress. The pale afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning the brown strands to a muted gold. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her knuckles were raw, but in her eyes was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had a home. It was not finished, but it was real. It had a spine. He stood there, watching her, and something inside him shifted, a tectonic plate of grief that had been locked in place for 3 years. She was building her cabin one log at a time. The simple truth of it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been watching a widow survive, but that wasn't it. He was watching a woman live. She was not just enduring, she was creating. She was taking the dead wood of the forest and breathing life into it, shaping it into a future. And in that instant, he was struck by a longing so sharp, so profound, it almost brought him to his knees. It was a hollow ache that spread from his chest through his entire body. He, the cowboy watching from the ridge, was a widower. But he was more than that. He was a widower longing for a family. He didn't just miss Margaret and Thomas. He missed the very idea of a home filled with life. He missed the purpose of it all. His own house was a perfectly preserved museum of his grief. It was a place of memory, not of living. What he saw in Sarah Brennan, perched on the wall of her half-built cabin, was the fierce, beautiful, messy business of life itself. He wanted to belong to it again. He wanted to build something that was not a monument to the past, but a shelter for the future. When she climbed down, she saw the look on his face. "Are you all right, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked, a flicker of concern in her voice. He blinked, as if coming out of a trance. He straightened up, pushing away from the wall. "Jacob," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "My name is Jacob." He offered her a small, hesitant smile, the first she had ever seen on his face. It was a rusty, unused thing, but it reached his eyes. "And I believe we've earned a cup of that coffee." That smile broke the dam of their silence. Over coffee by the fire, the conversation started to flow, a trickle at first, then a steady stream. He told her a dry, funny story about Moses, his old foreman, who claimed he could predict the severity of the winter by the thickness of a squirrel's fur. Sarah found herself laughing, a real, unburdened laugh that surprised them both. The sound was foreign and wonderful in the quiet valley. A few evenings later, as the last of the light bled from the sky, they sat inside the cabin. A fire crackled in the newly finished hearth, casting warm, dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air. It felt, for the first time, like a home. "You never said what brought you to this particular piece of nowhere," Jacob said, his voice quiet. He wasn't prying, merely making conversation. Sarah stared into the flames for a long time, tracing the patterns with her eyes. "My husband, Ben," she began, her voice low. "He loved this kind of country. Said a man could breathe out here." She took a sip of her coffee, the tin cup warm in her hands. "He was a good man, too trusting. Maybe we had a small place, down near the Gallatin. He got into a dispute over a water right with a man who had more money and fewer scruples, a man named Vernon Nash." She paused, and Jacob remained silent, letting her tell it in her own time. Nash couldn't win the claim fair, so he won it dirty. He spread lies, accused Ben of altering survey markers. It wasn't true, not a word of it, but mud sticks, especially in a small town. People we'd known for years started looking through us on the street. The bank called in our loan. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, but filled with an old, cold anger. Ben wasn't a fighter. Not in that way. He couldn't stand the shame of being thought a cheat. It ate at him. He faded. The doctor called it lung fever. But I knew he died of a broken heart, as surely as if Nash had put a bullet in it. She looked up from the fire, her eyes meeting his. "I sold what little we had left and came here. I wanted a place that was clean, a place that didn't have any memories attached, a place I could build with my own hands, so that no one could ever say it wasn't mine or that I didn't earn it, fair and square." Her story explained everything about her, her fierce independence, her distrust of strangers, her relentless drive. She was not just building a cabin, she was rebuilding her life on a foundation of her own making, a foundation that no man's lies could ever shake. The town of Timber Creek, with its prejudices and its quick judgments, was exactly the kind of place she was running from. Jacob looked at her, at the strength in the set of her jaw, the sorrow that still lingered in the depths of her eyes. The admiration he felt for her deepened into something more solid, something more profound. He understood now. You couldn't build a life on pity or handouts. It had to be built on something solid, something you could trust, like a well-notched log, like the word of an honest man, like the quiet courage of a woman building her home. One piece of timber, one act of faith, at a time. The progress they had made was a tangible thing, a testament to their shared labor. The cabin now had 4 solid walls, a floor, and a complete roof frame. All that remained was the sheathing and the sod, and the delicate work of fitting the door and window. For this, Sarah had set aside her best logs, straight-grained and free of knots, seasoned and ready. They were her prize, the finishing touch, the final barrier against the wildness outside. She woke one morning to a violation. The air was still and cold, but a deeper chill went through her when she stepped outside. The logs were gone. The space where they had been neatly stacked was now just a collection of scuffs and drag marks in the frosted earth. A hollow, sick feeling opened in her stomach. It wasn't just the loss of the wood, the days of back-breaking labor required to fell and prepare it. It was the trespass. Her small, fiercely guarded sanctuary had been breached. The world she had tried to shut out had reached in and stolen a piece of her future. When Jacob arrived, he found her standing over the empty space, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face a pale, taut mask of fury and despair. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance: the missing logs, the tracks leading away toward the creek, the rigid set of Sarah's shoulders. He didn't need to ask what had happened. "How many?" he asked, his voice a low growl. 8, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "The best ones, for the doorframe and the roof beams." He dismounted and walked to the tracks, crouching to examine them. 3 men, shoddy boots. Not from around here. They're dragging them, not using a wagon. He stood up, his face hard as granite. They won't have gotten far. He turned and started back toward his horse. "Where are you going?" she called after him, a note of desperation in her voice. "To get your lumber back," he said, his hand already on the rifle in its saddle scabbard. "No, Jacob, don't!" She ran to him, grabbing his arm. The thought of him facing 3 desperate men for her sake filled her with a terror that eclipsed her anger. "It's just wood. I can cut more." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. The quiet calm she had come to know was gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous light. "It's not just wood, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and final. "It's the principle. A man doesn't steal another's labor, not in this country." He gently removed her hand from his arm. "Stay inside, bar the door. I'll be back before noon." She watched him ride away, a dark, implacable figure moving with lethal purpose. The morning dragged on, each minute an agony of suspense. She tried to work, to busy her hands, but her mind was filled with terrible images: a fight, a shot, his riderless horse returning alone. She had spent so long building walls to keep the world out, and now she had let one person in, only to send him out to face the very dangers she had fled. It was nearly noon when she heard the sound of a horse. She ran to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was him. He was leading his gelding, and behind it, he had tethered the 3 men she presumed were the thieves. They were a sorry-looking trio, gaunt and ragged, their hands bound in front of them. They shuffled along, their heads down, avoiding her gaze. Trailing behind them, dragged by ropes, were her logs. Jacob pulled up in front of the cabin, his face grim. He said nothing to her, his attention fixed on the 3 men. "Unload the wood," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Stack it exactly where you found it." He swung down from his horse, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The men, sullen and defeated, did as they were told, their movements clumsy with exhaustion and fear. Sarah watched, a storm of emotions churning inside her, relief so profound it made her weak, anger at the thieves, and a deep, unsettling gratitude toward the man who stood like a sentinel, guarding her home. When the last log was in place, Jacob gestured with his rifle toward the trail leading out of the valley. "I'm letting you go," he said to the men, his voice low and cold. "Because it's a hard country and winter's coming. But if I ever see your faces in this valley again, I will not be so forgiving. Now, get—" He untied them, and they fled without a backward glance, disappearing into the trees like startled deer. Silence descended once more. Jacob stood for a moment, watching the trail, before turning to face her. The hard light in his eyes had softened. He looked tired. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt wholly inadequate. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. He looked at her, at the cabin, at the stolen logs now returned to their rightful place. "Yes," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "I did." He needed to. She saw it in his eyes. This was not about her, not entirely. It was about him. It was an affirmation, a drawing of a line in the sand. He was not just the man who had lost everything. He was a man who could still protect something. That night, Jacob dreamt of Margaret. It was not the usual dream, the hazy, painful memory of her sickness. This was a dream of before. They were in the kitchen of their house, the one that was now so silent. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Margaret was laughing, her head thrown back, her brown hair catching the light. She was trying to teach him to waltz, her hands on his shoulders, guiding his clumsy feet. He could feel the warmth of her, smell the faint scent of flower and roses that always clung to her. He could hear the sound of their son, Thomas, giggling from his playpen in the corner. The dream was so real, so suffused with a happiness he had forgotten existed, that it was a physical agony. He felt a joy so pure it was like a blade in his heart. He woke with a gasp, the phantom feeling of Margaret's hand in his fading into the cold, empty air of his bedroom. The house was dark and silent. The ghost of her laughter echoed in the stillness, a cruel mockery. And then, unbidden, another face rose in his mind, Sarah's. Her expression when she saw him return with her stolen wood, a mixture of fear and relief, and a fragile, dawning trust. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. He felt like the lowest kind of betrayer. He had been so lost in his grief, so faithful to the memory of his wife and child, and now he had allowed another woman to find a crack in the wall of his mourning. The small moments of warmth and shared laughter with Sarah, the feeling of purpose he'd had in defending her, it all felt like a stain on the perfect, hallowed ground of his loss. He was forgetting. He was moving on. He was leaving his family behind. He rose from the bed and stood by the window, looking out at the moon-blanched landscape. He had thought his heart was a dead thing, a stone in his chest, but it wasn't. It was beating, and it was aching, and it was, to his shame, capable of feeling something new. The next day, he was a different man. The easy camaraderie they had built was gone, replaced by a wall of stoic, impenetrable silence. He worked with a grim, relentless efficiency, his movements mechanical, his face a closed door. He answered her questions with grunts or single words, his eyes avoiding hers. The space between them, which had been shrinking day by day, was now a vast, frozen chasm. Sarah felt his withdrawal like a physical chill. She tried to break through it, offering him coffee, asking about his ranch, but her words fell into the silence and died. The work, which had become a source of connection, was now just a shared, joyless task. The harmony was gone. By late afternoon, she could bear it no longer. They were fitting the doorframe, using the very logs he had recovered. He held a beam in place while she prepared to drive a wooden peg into the joint. "Jacob," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Look at me." He did, reluctantly, and his eyes were full of a pain so deep it startled her. He looked like a trapped animal. "What is it?" she asked gently. "What have I done?" "It's not you," he said, his voice rough. He looked away, focusing on the wood. "It's me. I shouldn't be here." The words hit her like a slap. Because you helped me, because you feel you owe me something. No, he said, shaking his head. Because I'm starting to feel something, and I have no right. And then she understood. She saw the ghost of his wife standing between them, a shadow she could not fight. Her own experience with Ben had taught her the complex geography of grief, its treacherous borders and hidden valleys. She knew this territory. She put down her mallet and looked at him, her gaze soft with a compassion that came from a place of shared sorrow. Grief isn't betrayal, Jacob, she said, the words coming out soft but clear in the still, cold air. The dead don't want us dead too. He flinched as if she had struck him. He slowly lowered the beam he was holding, letting it rest on the ground. He stood there for a long moment, his broad back to her, his head bowed. His shoulders began to shake, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor at first, then a violent, racking shudder. He turned, and his face was a ruin. Tears streamed from his eyes, carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. They were silent tears, the tears of a man who had held his sorrow in for so long that he had forgotten how to make a sound. He stumbled over to the woodpile and sank down onto a log, his face in his hands, his body convulsing with the force of 3 years of unshed grief. Sarah did not go to him, did not touch him. She knew that this was a private, sacred agony. He was not just crying for his wife and child. He was crying for the man he had been, for the life he had lost, and for the terrifying, unwelcome possibility of a new one. She simply stood nearby, a silent witness, her presence a quiet affirmation that he was not alone in his pain. She was offering him the one thing he had denied himself for so long, permission to feel. The stolen wood had been recovered, and now, in the ruins of a strong man's sorrow, the real healing could begin. His breakdown had cleared the air between them in the way a lightning strike clears a humid summer sky. The tension was gone, but in its place was a fragile, shimmering stillness. Jacob's grief, now openly acknowledged, was no longer a ghost haunting the space between them, but a shared landscape of sorrow they could navigate together. They worked differently in the days that followed. The silence returned, but it was a comfortable, companionable silence now, punctuated by easy conversation and the occasional shared smile. He told her about his ranch, the stubbornness of his cattle, the wisdom of his old foreman, Moses. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, the greenness of it, a world away from this stark, beautiful country. They were learning the histories of one another, filling in the blank pages. The cabin was nearly a home. They had hung the door, a solid thing made from the wood he had reclaimed for her, and fitted a single glass-paned window that faced the morning sun. It was a luxury she hadn't dared to hope for, but Jacob had brought it from his ranch, carefully wrapped in quilts. Every house needs an eye to see the world from, he'd said, his voice gruff with an emotion that felt like shyness. The second storm arrived with the ferocity of an ambush. One moment, the sky was a high, clear blue. The next, a wall of churning, bruised purple cloud was boiling over the western ridge. The wind did not rise. It fell upon them like a physical blow, a solid, screaming force that flattened the tall grasses and sent loose debris cartwheeling across the valley. "Get inside," Jacob yelled, his words nearly snatched away by the gale. He had been on the roof, securing the final layer of sod, and he scrambled down the ladder with a speed that belied his size. They stumbled into the cabin, pulling the heavy door shut just as the first wave of sleet, hard as buckshot, rattled against the new wood. They stood in the dim interior, breathing heavily, the roar of the wind a deafening, elemental fury outside. It was a sound of pure, mindless rage, the sound of a world being torn apart. The small cabin, which had felt so sturdy and solid moments before, now seemed like a flimsy wooden box tossed on a vast, angry sea. The log walls groaned under the assault. A fine powder of snow began to sift through the tiny cracks between the logs, a ghostly reminder of the monster that raged outside. "It'll hold," Jacob said, his voice a low reassurance against the storm's shriek. He moved to the hearth and began to build a fire, his movements calm and methodical, a small island of order in the chaos. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. The wind found a new, higher note, a keening wail that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The small cabin was their entire world, a tiny, flickering bubble of warmth and light in a universe of frozen, howling darkness. Jacob had brought his saddlebags in, and from them, he produced a packet of dried beef and a small flask. Sarah added the last of her coffee to the pot. It wasn't a meal, but it was sustenance, a small act of normalcy in a world gone mad. They sat on the floor before the fire, the rough-hewn planks still smelling of fresh-cut pine. They were close, their shoulders almost touching, drawn together by the need for shared warmth and the simple, primal comfort of another human presence. The firelight carved their faces out of the shadows, making them strangers and, at the same time, more intimately known to each other than ever before. "I've never heard a wind like this," Sarah said, her voice a near whisper, as if a loud noise might invite the storm inside. "It's a blizzard," Jacob replied, staring into the flames. "A real one. We'll be here a while." He took a pull from the flask and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it, the fiery liquid a welcome shock that spread warmth through her chest. The hours passed, measured not by a clock but by the shifting of the logs in the fire. They spoke of things they had never spoken of before, their words soft and stripped of pretense by the fury outside. They were two souls huddled together at the end of the world. "Sometimes," Jacob said, his voice low and rough. "I'm afraid I'm forgetting his face, my boy, Thomas. I close my eyes and try to picture him, and the image is thin, like a photograph left out in the sun." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-reproach. "A man shouldn't forget his own son's face." "You're not forgetting," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "You're remembering the feeling of him, the warmth of his hand in yours, the sound of his laugh. Those things don't fade. Jacob, they just sink deeper. They become a part of the blood and bone of you." He looked at her then, his gray eyes filled with a raw, unguarded gratitude. He saw not a woman offering empty platitudes, but a fellow traveler in the barren lands of grief. Later, it was her turn. "I dream of the whispers," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the fire. "After Ben died, in town, the women looking at me over their teacups. The men looking at me in a different way. Like I was a piece of property that had lost its owner. It made me feel erased, as if Sarah Brennan didn't exist anymore. There was only Ben's widow." She pulled the thin blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders a little tighter. "That's why I had to build this place. I had to know there was still a me, separate from him, separate from them, a person who could stand on her own." As the night wore on, the cold intensified, seeping through the walls, a palpable, predatory thing. The fire, though bright, could not hold it entirely at bay. They were both shivering. "We need to share the blanket," Jacob said, his voice practical, matter-of-fact. Both of them. He had a heavy wool blanket in his saddle roll. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of awareness of the line they were about to cross. But the cold was a more immediate and pressing reality than propriety. She nodded. He laid his heavy horse blanket on the floor and then draped hers over the top. They lay down, side by side, their backs to the fire, a careful foot of space between them. But the cold was insidious. After a few minutes of shivering, Jacob spoke, his voice a low rumble in the near darkness. "This is foolish," he said. "We'll freeze like this." He shifted, turning onto his side to face her. "Come here." It was not a command, but an invitation, a plea, almost slowly, hesitantly. She turned to face him. He lifted the blanket, and she moved into the space beside him, into the circle of his warmth. He wrapped the blankets around them, cocooning them together. His body was a solid, living wall against the cold. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through his wool shirt. She rested her head on his arm, her cheek against the rough fabric of his duster, and the scent of leather, pine smoke, and clean, cold air filled her senses. For a long time, they lay in silence, listening to the symphony of the storm and the crackle of the fire. The shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, thawing warmth. It was more than physical. It was the slow, miraculous return of feeling to a part of her soul she had thought long frozen.
"Sarah,"
he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a part of the wind's song.
"Yes,"
she breathed. He shifted slightly, and his other hand came up to cup her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch so tender, so full of a hesitant wonder. It made her heart ache. She looked up at him. In the flickering, uncertain light of the fire, his face was a landscape of shadow and sorrow. But in his eyes, there was a light she had never seen before. It was a dawning hope, as fragile and as beautiful as the first light of a winter morning. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She rose to meet him, a silent consent, a shared desire. His lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, not of fire and demand. It was a question, a discovery. It was tentative, trembling, and profoundly gentle. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the salt of tears shed long ago. It was a kiss of shared solitude and mutual survival. In that simple, hesitant touch, she felt the echo of his loneliness, and he felt the resilience of her spirit. It was not the taking of a pleasure, but the offering of a comfort, a quiet, solemn promise that they were no longer entirely alone in the storm. They both knew, in that long, silent moment, that this was not about forgetting the ones they had lost. It was about honoring them by choosing to live. It was the first, shuddering breath after a long time underwater. It was the slow, painful, beautiful return of life. When they finally broke apart, they did not speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. He simply held her, his arms a safe harbor in the storm, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. She fell asleep, not to the sound of whispers or the howl of the wind, but to the sound of a man breathing beside her in the dark. She woke to silence, a profound, absolute silence that was more startling than the storm's fury. The wind was gone. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. A soft, ethereal light filled the cabin, filtering through the single window. She was still in his arms. Sometime in the night, they had shifted, and she was curled against him, his arm a heavy, protective weight around her. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head. Jacob was awake, watching her. His eyes, in the pale morning light, were clear and calm. There was no regret in them, no shame, only a quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He raised his hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her forehead. His touch was as gentle as it had been in the night. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. A small smile touched his lips. The storms passed. She nodded. It seemed so. They lay there for another moment, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the morning. Then, with a shared, unspoken understanding, they rose. They moved about the small cabin, rebuilding the fire, making coffee, their movements synchronous, comfortable. They did not speak of the kiss. They did not need to. It was there in the air between them, a new, unspoken foundation upon which they could now build. When Sarah opened the door, the world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of snow, sculpted by the wind into fantastical drifts and curves. The sun was bright in a sapphire sky, and its light on the snow was so brilliant it hurt the eyes. The world was new. It was a clean slate. They stepped outside into the clean, cold air. Jacob looked at the finished roof, the solid walls, the sturdy door. Then he looked at her, and his smile was no longer a rusty, unused thing. It was real, and it transformed his face. "Well," he said, picking up his axe from where he had left it inside. "Reckon we have a cabin to finish." Sarah picked up hers, the familiar weight a comfort in her hands. She looked at the cabin, then at him, and her own smile met his. They were not just building a house anymore. They were building a home, and they were building it with a new energy, a new hope, born in the heart of a blizzard. The fragile peace of the valley could not last. A world built for two, insulated by snow and shared labor, is a fragile thing in a land where loneliness is a disease and gossip is its vector. The change began not in the valley, but 10 miles east, in the small, tightly wound town of Timber Creek. Jacob Hartwell was a man of routine. His absence was noted. His ranch hands, a discreet bunch by nature, could not help but mutter in the bunkhouse about the boss's daily rides toward Willow Creek, returning long after dark. A man doesn't spend that much time helping a neighbor build a cabin without raising questions. The questions found fertile ground in the dry, pious soil of the town's social order. They were whispered over barrels of flour in the general store, murmured over lukewarm beers in the saloon. The subject was always the same, the Brennan widow, the strange, reclusive woman building a life for herself, where no decent woman should be alone. And now, Jacob Hartwell, a man whose grief had been the town's most respected monument for 3 years, was spending his days in her company. The whispers turned to speculation, and speculation. In a town starved for drama, quickly hardened into judgment. The architects of this judgment were two people who, for different reasons, felt their interests threatened by Sarah's very existence. The first was Matilda Whitfield, a stern, wealthy widow who had appointed herself the guardian of Timber Creek's morality. Her own husband had left her with a considerable fortune and a rigid sense of propriety that she wielded like a cattle prod. She saw in Sarah Brennan a dangerous anomaly, an independent woman who did not conform, who did not seek the town's approval or its protection. She saw Jacob's interest in her as a personal affront, a deviation from the respectable, mournful path she believed all widowers should walk. The second was a man Sarah knew only as a name from a nightmare, Vernon Nash, having sold his holdings in the Gallatin Valley under a cloud of his own making. Nash had drifted north, looking for new opportunities. He was a man with a nose for weakness and a talent for exploiting it. When he heard talk of a stubborn widow named Brennan staking a claim out on Willow Creek, a cold, calculating interest sparked within him. He had not forgotten the woman who had defied him, whose husband had wilted under his pressure. The news that she was alone and now, apparently entangled with a prominent rancher, presented an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Nash and Matilda Whitfield found in each other a convenient alliance. He provided the grimy details, twisting the story of Sarah's past into a narrative of a flighty, untrustworthy woman. She, in turn, laundered his slander through the wash of public concern, lending it the weight of her social standing. The storm of their making broke at a public meeting in the town hall. The official purpose was to discuss the allocation of funds for a new bridge, a dry but necessary piece of civic business. But everyone knew the bridge was not the real reason the hall was filled to capacity on a cold Thursday evening. Jacob was there. He had resisted going, the easy quiet of the valley having become his preferred world. But Sarah had encouraged him. "You can't hide forever." "Jacob," she'd said, a gentle teasing in her voice. "And neither can I. We have to live in the world." So he had gone, as a first step, a gesture of rejoining the community he had long since abandoned. Sarah had decided to come into town the next day for supplies. It was a plan, a slow re-entry into the life they had both forsaken. He felt the change in atmosphere the moment he walked in. The hum of conversation dropped. He was met with a wall of eyes, curious, cold, appraising. He nodded stiffly to men he'd known his whole life and took a seat near the back, feeling the weight of their scrutiny like a physical burden. His honor, his family's name, was a heavy cloak he had worn his entire life. For the first time, it felt suffocating. After the tedious business of the bridge was concluded, the town elder, Mr. Abernathy, asked if there was any new business. There was a pause, a collective holding of breath. Then Matilda Whitfield stood up, her black bombazine dress rustling like dried leaves. "I believe there is a matter of public concern," she began, her voice clear and carrying, dripping with a false sincerity. "It concerns the character of our community. We are a God-fearing people, a town of families. And yet, we have allowed a certain element to take root nearby, a situation that threatens the moral fabric of Timber Creek." She did not look at Jacob, but every other person in the room did. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. "I speak of the woman living alone out on Willow Creek," Matilda continued, her voice gaining strength. "A woman of unknown history, living without supervision or chaperone, and now, it seems she has drawn one of our most respected citizens into her orbit, a man still in mourning, whose good name is being tarnished by this unseemly association." The accusation, veiled as it was, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Someone in the crowd coughed. Vernon Nash, standing near the front, smirked. This was the moment. The town turned as one to look at Jacob Hartwell, their unspoken question demanding an answer. Defend her, deny it, say something. Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. A war was raging inside him. One part of him, the new part that had been awakened by Sarah's quiet strength, wanted to stand up and unleash a torrent of fury on these small, judgmental people. He wanted to tell them of her courage, her decency, her honor that burned brighter than all their pious hypocrisy combined. But the older part of him, the part that was the son of his father, the grieving husband of Margaret, the master of a great ranch, was paralyzed. He could hear his father's voice in his head. A man's name is all he has. He could see the imagined disappointment on Margaret's face. To stand up for Sarah now would be to publicly declare his intentions, to confirm their ugliest suspicions. It would mean dragging his name and the memory of his wife through the mud of their gossip. In that agonizing moment of silence, his fear of losing his standing, the last remnant of his old life, was stronger than his courage. He looked down at his hands, his jaw locked, and said nothing. His silence was his answer. It was a confirmation of their worst assumptions, an abdication of his responsibility to her. A low murmur went through the crowd, a sound of grim satisfaction. Matilda Whitfield sat down, her victory complete, and it was in that moment of her triumph that the hall door opened at the back of the room. Sarah Brennan stood there, a basket on her arm. She had finished her work early and decided to ride in tonight, to surprise Jacob, to perhaps sit with him at the meeting, to take that first step together. She had arrived in time to hear Matilda's speech and to witness the deafening roar of Jacob's silence. Their eyes met across the crowded room. She saw not a man, but a statue, frozen by fear. She saw the betrayal, not as a malicious act, but as a deep, hollow failure of nerve. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the heart of the blizzard withered and died in the cold, airless room. Her face, which had been lit with anticipation, became a mask of quiet, profound sorrow. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply turned, with a dignity that shamed every person in that room, and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The sound of that soft click was louder to Jacob than a gunshot. It was the sound of a door closing not just on the room, but on him, on what they had built. The spell was broken. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards, and strode out of the hall, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. But she was gone. The street was empty save for the cold, indifferent moonlight. He knew where she was going. Back to the valley. Back to the walls she had built to protect herself. Walls he had just proven she still desperately needed. The next day, Vernon Nash, emboldened by the town's verdict and Jacob's cowardice, filed a formal claim at the land office. He alleged that the claimant on the Willow Creek parcel, one Sarah Brennan, had failed to meet the requirements of the Homestead Act, specifically the clause requiring the completion of a permanent dwelling within the allotted time. He claimed, merely asserting his right as a citizen to claim the abandoned property. It was a lie, a perversion of the law, but in the current climate, it was a lie that might just stick. Jacob heard the news in the saloon, and it was the final blow. He had not only failed to defend her honor, his failure had now cost her her home. He bought a bottle of whiskey and rode back to his ranch, not to the ridge overlooking her valley, but to the grand, empty house that was his prison. He drank. He sat in the dark, silent living room where Margaret's ghost resided and poured glass after glass, seeking an oblivion that would not come. The whiskey only sharpened the edges of his shame, making the memory of Sarah's face in the doorway more vivid, more accusatory. He was still there, slumped in his chair, the bottle half empty on the table beside him. When Moses came in, the old foreman did not light a lamp. He stood in the shadows, his presence a silent judgment. "Heard what happened in town?" Moses said, his voice flat. Jacob didn't answer. He just poured another drink, his hand unsteady. "Heard what Nash did, too." Still, Jacob said nothing. Moses took a step further into the room. The scent of stale whiskey hung in the air like a shroud. "When Margaret and the boy died," the old man said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rasp, "you died, too. You just kept walking and breathing. That woman, she was bringing you back to life. I saw it. We all saw it." He paused, letting the words sink into the drunken gloom. "Now look at you, hiding in the dark with a bottle, letting that snake Nash steal her land after you let that town of crows steal her name. You had a choice. Jacob, you could have chosen to live." Moses' voice was filled with a lifetime of disappointment. "Instead, you're choosing death all over again." The old man turned and left, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. Jacob was left alone in the darkness, the bottle in his hand. Moses' words ringing in the silence. He had lost his love. He had lost his honor. And now, he was losing himself. He was a dead man, choosing his own grave. The whiskey did not bring oblivion, only a throbbing headache and a shame so acidic it felt like it was dissolving him from the inside out. Jacob woke to the cold, gray light of dawn, slumped in the chair in his silent house. The empty bottle stood on the table like a tombstone. Moses' words hung in the air, more damning than any accusation the town could level. "You're choosing death all over again." He had wrapped himself in the shroud of his grief for so long it had become his skin. He had treated the memory of his wife and son not as a comfort, but as a cage. And when a chance at life had reached through the bars, he had flinched, terrified of the light. He stood, his body stiff and aching, and walked out of the house, leaving the bottle where it lay. He did not saddle his horse. He walked. He crossed the yard, past the barn and the bunkhouse where his men were beginning to stir, and up the gentle slope of the hill behind the house. He walked until he reached the two small, white crosses enclosed by a simple wooden fence. The ground was cold and hard beneath his boots. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands, the chill morning air doing little to cool the fever of his self-loathing. For 3 years, he had come here and stood in silence, a stoic, unmoving monument to his own loss. He never spoke. The grief was too vast, too sacred for words. But today was different. Today, the silence was a lie. He knelt, the motion stiff and unfamiliar, and rested a hand on the cold, damp earth of Margaret's grave. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice a raw, cracked thing. The sound of her name on his own lips was a shock. He hadn't spoken it aloud since the funeral, I'm sorry. I failed. He squeezed his eyes shut. The image of Sarah's face in the doorway of the town hall burned onto the back of his eyelids. There's a woman, a good woman, strong. She's alive. Maggie, in a way I'd forgotten how to be. And I let them tear her down. I sat there and I said nothing. I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd think. Afraid of dishonoring you. The confession hung in the still air. He had given his fear a name, and it was a coward's fear. He looked at the simple, carved name on the wooden cross. Margaret Hartwell. Beloved wife and mother. She had been a woman full of laughter, of kindness, of life. She had fought the fever with a quiet ferocity. Not for herself, but for him and for their son. She had never, in all the years he had known her, chosen the easy path over the right one. I've been acting like my love for you was a debt that could only be paid with misery, he said, the words tumbling out now, a torrent of long-suppressed truth. Like I had to stay dead to prove I loved you when you were alive. But that's not right, is it? That's not what you would want. He looked from her cross to the smaller one beside it. Thomas Hartwell, our boy. You wouldn't want me to be this man, this ghost. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the clean, cold air. A profound, impossible sense of clarity washed over him. It wasn't Margaret's ghost holding him back, it was his own. His love for her was not a cage, it was the foundation on which he had built his life, and a foundation was meant to be built upon, not left as a ruin. You'd want me to live, wouldn't you? Maggie, he asked the silent earth, you'd want me to fight for what's right, for what's good. The only answer was the whisper of the wind through the pines, but it was enough. He stood up, a different man than the one who had knelt. The grief was still there, a permanent part of his soul, but the guilt had been lifted. He was no longer a man defined by his loss. He was a man defined by what he was about to do. He strode back to the house, not to the whiskey bottle, but to the small, dusty office where he kept his ledgers. He was a rancher, a businessman. His power in Timber Creek was not just in his name, but in the debts and deeds recorded in black ink in his books. He spent an hour poring over the pages, his mind sharp and focused. He knew Vernon Nash was a newcomer, but a man like Nash always left a trail. He found it not under Nash's name, but under the name of the saloon owner, a man named Finnerty. Finnerty had recently expanded, and the loan had been underwritten by a bank in Helena. Jacob knew the banker, and Nash, he recalled hearing, was a silent partner in Finnerty's new venture. It was a slender thread, but it was enough. He rode into Timber Creek in the late afternoon. He did not ride like a man in shame, but like the man he once was, straight-backed and resolute. He went first to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Helena. Then he walked to the saloon. The place was full, a haze of smoke and the low murmur of conversation filling the room. As he entered, a hush fell. He ignored the stairs and walked directly to the bar where Vernon Nash was holding court, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Nash," Jacob said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence, "I want a word with you." Nash turned, a slow, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. "Hartwell, come to offer your congratulations. The Willow Creek claim should be mine by the end of the week." "The only thing that will be yours by the end of the week." "Nash," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level, "is a long, hard ride out of this territory." Nash laughed, a short, ugly sound. Big words from a man who couldn't find his tongue 2 nights ago. "I found it," Jacob said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers, slapping them down on the bar. "They were the mortgage documents for this very saloon. I just sent a wire to a friend at the bank in Helena. He was very interested to hear about the character of Mr. Finnerty's new business partner. So interested, in fact, that he was happy to sell me this loan, which means, Nash, that as of this morning, you're drinking in my saloon." Nash's smirk vanished. Finnerty, the saloon owner, went pale behind the bar. I also mentioned your business in the Gallatin Valley, Jacob continued, his voice relentless. The water rights dispute, the doctored survey maps, the way a good man named Ben Brennan was ruined by your lies. It seems a man's reputation follows him. He turned from Nash to face the rest of the room. He swept his gaze over the silent, watching faces, men who had been his neighbors his whole life. You all sat in the town hall and you judged a woman you don't even know, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that shamed them all. You listened to the poison whispered by this parasite and the sanctimonious pronouncements of others. And you said nothing. Well, I was one of you. I sat there in silence, and for that, I will be ashamed for the rest of my days. But no more. He took a step forward, his presence filling the room. Sarah Brennan came to this valley seeking nothing but a piece of ground to call her own. She has worked harder than any man in this room to build a life from scratch. She has more honor in one hand than this entire town has shown in a week. She is worth more than 10 of the men in this room. And if any of you wants to judge her, you will have to judge me with her. He let the challenge hang in the air. A few men looked down at their boots, ashamed. Others met his gaze, a new respect dawning in their eyes. The town blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Peterson, gave a slow, deliberate nod. So, here's how it is going to be, Jacob said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Mr. Nash is going to go to the land office first thing in the morning and withdraw his fraudulent claim. Then he is going to pack his bags and ride out. And we, he said, his gaze sweeping the room again, are going to help Mrs. Brennan finish her home. The next morning, as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, a strange procession made its way toward Willow Creek. It was Jacob Hartwell on his gray gelding, and behind him was a wagon driven by Peterson the blacksmith, filled with tools and sacks of grain. Behind that was another wagon, and another, carrying men from the town ranch hands, a carpenter, men who had been moved by Jacob's stand, or who were simply tired of the town's petty cruelties. They were a small army of redemption, come to right a wrong. They found Sarah outside her cabin. She was splitting firewood, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she saw them approach, she froze, her hand tightening on the handle of her axe. She saw not help, but a mob. Her face was a pale, guarded mask. Jacob halted the procession and dismounted, walking toward her alone. He stopped a respectful distance away, his heart aching at the fear and mistrust in her eyes, a fear he had put there. Sarah, he said, his voice quiet. She said nothing, just watched him, her knuckles white on the axe handle. I was wrong, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire soul. I was a coward, and I am sorry. He gestured back at the wagons, at the men waiting patiently. Nash is gone. His claim is withdrawn. We've come to help you finish. The law says the dwelling must be complete. We'll make sure it is. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the man who had sat in silence, for the ghost who had been afraid to live. But he was not there. In his place was a man she had only glimpsed before, a man of quiet strength and unwavering conviction. She saw the shame in his eyes, but she also saw a new and powerful resolve. She saw the man who had ridden into a blizzard for her, the man who had faced down thieves to reclaim her property. Her gaze shifted past him to the men in the wagons. They were not a mob. They were neighbors. She saw the blacksmith, Peterson, who had once fixed her mule's shoe and refused payment. She saw other faces, familiar from her few trips to town, now looking at her not with judgment, but with a quiet respect. Her grip on the axe handle loosened. The wall she had rebuilt around her heart, so thick and impenetrable, trembled. Trust was not built on words and promises. She knew that better than anyone. It was built on action. It was built one log at a time. And here were a dozen men, led by the one who had wounded her most deeply, who had come not with words, but with hammers and saws and willing hands. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned the axe against the cabin wall. She looked back at Jacob, and for the first time since that terrible night in town, she met his eyes without a shield. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was everything. A slow smile of pure, unadulterated relief spread across Jacob's face. He turned to the men. "All right," he called out, his voice strong and clear in the crisp morning air. "Let's get to work." What had begun as an act of penance transformed into a celebration of community. The valley, which for so long had been a silent witness to a solitary woman's struggle, now echoed with the sounds of hammers, the rasp of saws, and the low murmur of men's voices working in concert. It was the sound of a town rebuilding its own conscience. Peterson the blacksmith, a man of few words and mighty arms, directed the raising of the final roof beams with the quiet authority of a master craftsman. Others, men who had sat in silent judgment in the town hall, now worked with a focused energy, as if their sweat could wash away their shame. Sarah moved among them, no longer an outsider, but the undisputed heart of the enterprise. She kept a great pot of coffee perpetually simmering over an open fire, her hands, though calloused and scarred, moving with a steady grace as she handed out tin cups. She answered questions about the placement of a window frame, the angle of a porch step, her voice clear and certain. She was not the beneficiary of their charity. She was the architect of her own home, and they were her willing crew. Jacob worked at her side, a quiet, constant presence. He moved with a renewed purpose, the weight of his old grief replaced by the solid heft of fresh-cut timber. He and Sarah fell into their old rhythm, a silent language of shared glances and anticipated needs. But now, others were part of that language. He saw the way the other men looked at her, their initial pity and suspicion replaced by a deep, abiding respect. They saw what he saw, a spirit as strong and unyielding as the Montana landscape itself. The work went quickly. With so many hands, the tasks that would have taken Sarah weeks were completed in days. The sod was laid on the roof, thick and green. A small porch was added, a place to sit and watch the sunset over the ridge. The interior was chinked with a mixture of mud and moss, sealing out the last of the wind. The cabin was no longer a desperate shelter. It was a home, solid and true, built not just of logs, but of the restored honor of a community. They were finishing the last of the chinking when he appeared. Vernon Nash rode out of the trees, not with the swagger of a victor, but with the festering malice of a cornered snake. He was alone, and in his hand he held a pistol. The cheerful sounds of work died away. Men reached for the rifles that were never far, leaning against wagons or the cabin wall. "This ain't over," Nash snarled, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He pointed the pistol not at Jacob, but at the cabin itself. "This is my claim. I filed the papers. This is my land." Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between Nash and Sarah. "You withdrew the claim. Nash, you're trespassing." "A piece of paper in a dusty office means nothing out here," Nash spat, waving the pistol erratically. "This is how claims are settled." But before Jacob could respond, Sarah stepped out from behind him. She moved with a calm that was more commanding than any threat. She did not look afraid. She looked angry. In her hand, she held a single folded document. She walked past Jacob, her eyes fixed on Nash, and stopped at the edge of the new porch. "This is what settles claims." "Mr. Nash," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tense silence. She held up the paper. It was her deed, the official survey and title from the land office, stamped and sealed. "This says this land is mine, this house, built with my hands, is mine. You have no rights here." Nash's face contorted in a sneer. "That paper won't stop a bullet." He raised the pistol, his aim wavering. At that moment, another rider appeared, coming up the trail from town at a steady trot. It was the sheriff, a lanky, mustachioed man named Elias Thorne. He took in the scene with a practiced, weary-eye Nash with his pistol, the silent, armed men, and the woman standing on her own porch, holding a piece of paper like a shield. "Nash," the sheriff said, his voice mild but carrying a core of iron. "I suggest you put that firearm away before you do something you'll have a long time to regret." "She's on my land," Sheriff Nash insisted, his voice cracking. "No, son," the sheriff said, dismounting slowly. "She's on her land. I was at the land office this morning myself to see that your withdrawal was properly recorded. You're the one who is trespassing. Now, I'll give you two choices. You can hand me that pistol and ride out of this county for good, or you can try your luck. But I'll tell you this. There are a dozen rifles here that say you won't like the odds." Nash looked from the sheriff's calm, determined face to the cold, unforgiving eyes of the men surrounding him. He saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw only the finality of a world that had closed its doors to him. His bluff had been called with a curse. He lowered the pistol. The sheriff walked over and took it from his unresisting hand. Justice had not come with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of a community standing together. That night, the valley was quiet again. The men had packed their tools and gone, leaving behind a finished cabin, a stack of firewood taller than a man, and a larder stocked with supplies from the town. As the last wagon disappeared over the rise, Sarah and Jacob stood on the porch of her new home. The setting sun painted the western sky in hues of rose and violet. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. He had saved her, not once, but twice. He had brought her back into a world that had cast her out. He turned to her, his face etched with the fading light and a deep, lingering vulnerability. "I'm still afraid," he confessed, the words a rough whisper. "Not of men like Nash, but of feeling again. I don't know if I remember how to do it right." She looked at him, her eyes soft with an understanding that went deeper than words. She reached out and took his hand, her small, calloused fingers lacing through his. "I'm afraid too," she said. "But look what we built." She gestured at the cabin, a dark, solid shape against the twilight. "We didn't build it all in one day. We laid one log, and then the next. We can do this the same way. We can build it one day at a time." He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes. The last of his defenses crumbled. He saw his future there, not as a replacement for his past, but as a continuation of his capacity to love. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not like the desperate, questioning kiss in the heart of the blizzard. This was a kiss of homecoming. It was quiet and sure, and filled with the promise of 1,000 sunrises to be seen from this very porch. There was no fear in it, only the warm, steady light of a lamp lit in a window, a beacon against the dark. Spring came to the valley not as a gentle thaw, but as a vibrant, green explosion of life. The snows receded, the aspens budded, and Willow Creek ran high and clear with meltwater. Jacob did not ride to the ridge to watch her anymore. He woke up beside her, in the cabin that now smelled of them of coffee and wood smoke, of shared sleep and quiet conversation. Together, they built a small stable for their horses and a sturdy corral. They tilled a patch of earth near the creek and planted a garden. On Sundays, their neighbors would sometimes ride out, bringing a freshly baked pie or a new tool, and they would sit on the porch and talk until dusk, their easy laughter a part of the valley's song. One afternoon, Jacob was mending a piece of fence while Sarah planted rows of seeds in the dark, rich soil. He stopped his work and watched her, her head bent in concentration, the sun warm on her back. A feeling of peace so profound, so complete, settled over him that it was almost overwhelming. She looked up, as if she had felt his gaze, and shaded her eyes with a dirt-smudged hand. She smiled at him, a simple, open, happy smile. And Jacob Hartwell smiled back. It was not the hesitant, rusty smile of a man relearning how to live. It was the deep, genuine, soul-deep smile of a man who was, finally and completely, home. She had built her cabin one log at a time. He had built his courage the same way. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.